up there in the north, in the capital of the Philippines, Manila. This is Max Lane here, down in Melbourne, Australia. I'm very honoured to be able to speak to you all this afternoon, but sad that I can't be up there in Manila attending all the sessions of the conference. I must say thank you to the organisers at University of Philippines for inviting me. And I'm, as I said, very honoured to be able to speak on this topic that relates to the 70th anniversary of the 1955 Bandung Asia-Africa Conference. It's not only the 70th anniversary of the Bandung Conference, it's also the centenary of the birth of the great Indonesian author Pramoedya Ananta Toer. And of course, the 1955 Bandung Conference was very much a conference organized by his generation of people who struggled to liberate Indonesia from Dutch colonialism. His generation is often called, or is usually called in Indonesia, the 1945 generation. 1945 being the year in which Indonesian independence was proclaimed, although it took another 5 years of struggle after that to kick out the Dutch. And of course, the 1955 generation is the same as the 1945 generation, that it was the generation that organized that Asia-Africa Bandung Conference. So of course, it's understandable. It's 10 years after the proclamation of independence, and actually, more remarkably in many ways, only 5 years after the Dutch were finally forced out of Indonesia, or at least the Dutch army and the Dutch bureaucracy was forced out of Indonesia, although in 1955, the Dutch colonial capitalists still controlled the Indonesian economy. So the timing here is in many ways very important and very natural. And at that time also, you had a government controlled, or government with the dominant political party was the Indonesian National Party, which along with the Indonesian Communist Party, which was still growing at that point, was dominant in the government and of a more nationalist character and more enthusiastic about the Asia-African Conference. Pramoedya, of course, related to that Asia-African Conference. I might note also that his editor and comrade who helped publish his books after he got out of Guru Island prison, 𝗍𝗍 was actively or directly involved in the Asia-Africa Conference as a young journalist. I remember 𝗍𝗶𝘁𝗶 telling many stories of his conversations with 𝗍𝗲 back then. And of course, that whole generation had a very internationalist orientation, not only in 1945, but amongst them from very early on. And I think it's interesting if we take Pramoedya Ananta's first two volumes of the Buruh Quartet, Bumi Manusia and Anak Semua Bangsa, we can already see how Pramoedya in his research identified that the consciousness that started to form at the beginning of the 20th century had a very strong internationalist origins to it. And there was a cultural revolution took place starting in the beginning of the 20th century, which laid the foundations for the creation later of the Indonesian nation. And I think in his books, in those particular two books, Bumi Manusia and Anak Semua Bangsa in particular, we can see that the origins of that cultural revolution both come from inspiration of anti-colonial struggles such as took place in Bali and in the northern tip of Sumatra, Aceh, plus white characters amongst the Javanese peasantry, Dongso and Suratia, some characters which we find in his works, exemplifying peasant rebellion against colonial power. But it wasn't just inspiration from within the Dutch East Indies, from within Indonesia in embryo formation. But there's also a strong element of international inspiration in his work. And of course, in 𝗩𝗏𝗶𝗃𝗁, child of all nations, and that's how I think Pramoedya viewed Indonesia as it came into being in the 20th century as a child of all nations. In particular, for example, the inspiration, there are characters in 𝗩𝗏𝗶𝗃𝗁 who are Chinese nationalist activists organizing the Chinese diaspora community in the Dutch East Indies, who really have an enormous influence on the main character in 𝗩𝗏𝗶𝗃𝗁, Minka. And Minka also, the main character, a young student, is also, it's shown that he was very familiar with what happened in the Philippines at the beginning of the 20th century, and this reality that the first republic in Asia was established in the Philippines. So we can see there that this internationalism is already there. China and the Philippines. But also we have to take into account here that Pramoedya's internationalism was not anti-West or anti-Europe in its essential character. The main character, Minka, is inspired by the discovery of 𝗍𝗏𝘁𝗶𝗃𝗁, of science, which he related to which he knew was connected to the scientific revolution that took place, that evolved in Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries. And it was also connected, of course, to the influence within the Dutch East Indies and amongst Indonesian intellectuals, or Indonesia to be intellectuals, of Dutch liberalism. Pramoedya in his works often makes reference to the Max Havelaar novels, and he's famous for an essay that was published in the New York Times, Pramoedya's essay, Max Havelaar, the book that killed colonialism, and in 𝗍𝗏𝘁𝗶𝗃𝗁 and 𝗩𝗏𝗶𝗃𝗁, there's often reference to the girl from Jepara, that is to say Kartini, whose letters were published by Dutch liberals, and which letters had a big influence on the thinking of young intellectuals in the Dutch East Indies at that time. So the internationalism evolves relating both to China and the Philippines, the anti-colonial struggles in China and the Philippines, but also an orientation to the positive aspects of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment in Europe. But of course, if you read Pramoedya, I think every single Dutch character, every single Western character, perhaps with the exception of Jean Marais, the one-armed Frenchman, there's also a massive contradiction, because liberty, equality, fraternity, the slogans of the French Revolution, connected, of course, to the whole history and evolution of the Enlightenment, were things which were not applied in the Dutch East Indies itself. So every single character you see is very annoying. They're all, to one extent or other, hypocrites. And I think this is special feature of how Pramoedya related to the European experience. He, people like the main character in his books, Minka, read the works that came out of the European Enlightenment in school and in newspapers, magazines, etc. But he experienced, or the whole of the Indonesian population experienced, the opposite of liberty, the opposite of equality, or the opposite of fraternity. So one of the things that Pramoedya said in many of his interviews, and I remember talking to him about this quite often, was that Europe betrayed its own achievements. Europe as a colonial force was counter-revolutionary against the revolutionary ideas that had emerged in Europe itself. And these counter-revolutionary ideas, betrayal of liberty, equality, fraternity, of course, in some ways were compatible with the kind of feudalism that existed in Java at the time, and which the Dutch also used to strengthen their own position. Pramoedya actually said in interviews that one of the weaknesses, one of the things that weakened the Indonesian national struggle and the development of Indonesian culture was that Indonesia did not learn enough from Europe. What was taken was not what was taken from Europe was not what can be learned or what had been written by Europe, progressive Europeans, Enlightenment Europeans, or left-wing Europeans later on, but what was taken from their practice in the colonial context. So that, I think that's an important thing to note. So I think Pramoedya's approach was, in that sense, very internationalist, taking from all nations. It wasn't based on a third world, as we come to understand it later, framework. And for him, Indonesia was embedded mainly in its location, the reality associated with its location. Pramoedya was never really concerned about identity. For him, it was the question of 𝗩𝗶𝘀𝗶𝗁, a scientific approach to understanding. So it was more a question of enlightenment, developing an enlightened approach based on science and understanding, rather than a question of belief. And I think Pramoedya's internationalism was indeed underlining the fact that Indonesia is a child of all nations, taking what's positive and progressive from everywhere. So we jumped from there to Bandung in 1955. As I said, it was a conference that was really a conference of, in the Indonesian context, a conference of the 1945 generation. And I think similarly for many of the other countries that played an important role, such as China or India, they're all still the generation of the people who led their national revolutions. For most, of course, some of the countries that attended had not had a revolutionary process, and that, of course, had an influence, a big influence on their political perspective. Of course, 𝗍𝗂𝗏 was a central figure at the Bandung conference. He was the, Indonesia was the host, although the idea, as I'm sure it's been discussed amongst you all already, is the idea also had a gestation period, which include meetings and discussions in India as well. I just want to emphasize here, though, that in terms of 𝗍𝗂𝗏 being president of Indonesia, Southeast Asian country, it must have taken a lot of courage to organize that conference within Southeast Asia, because basically Indonesia was isolated. As I know you've already discussed, the Philippines and Thailand were very pro-imperialist, pro-Western, pro-US at the state government level at that time. Of course, both were very important in the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization that developed during the 50s, the alliance with the United States. Of course, Malaya was still a British colony, Singapore was still a British colony. So 𝗍𝗂𝗏, in the Southeast Asian context in particular, that was a quite courageous initiative, I think. And I want to talk a bit later also about how 𝗍𝗂𝗏's own internationalism, I think, was very consistent with the anak semua bangsa, child of all nations kind of internationalism that we find in Pramoedya's description of the origins of Indonesia. But let's discuss a little bit more about the Bandung conference first. Of course, it was an amazing, I think, absolutely amazing celebration of sovereignty. As 𝗍𝗂𝗏 emphasized himself, was the first gathering of colored people's nations in history, and he also emphasized that it was, such a revolutionary thing to be able to hold that conference in their own countries, which of course they were never in a situation to do, to be able to do under colonialism. We have to note again the timing, 1955. So soon after World War II, it meant that there were still considerable divisions amongst the states. Some had not gone through deep revolutionary processes or any kind of actual revolutionary process. So you had different states. You had states that were hostile to US or Western imperialism, but others that advocated, as I'm sure you've also already discussed, a question of opposition to so-called all imperialism, including from the socialist bloc. And as you know, there was a debate and disputations during the Bandung conference, which ended up with part of the Bandung spirit actually being compromised, because the manifestos that came out in regard to imperialism failed to name any specific imperialism because of the necessity to compromise for unity's sake within the conference. So Bandung at one level was definitely, absolutely internationalism in practice, but it was a specific anti-imperialist internationalism of countries only 10 or 15 years after liberation. In Indonesia's case, 15 years after the proclamation of independence, but actually only 10 years after actually kicking out the Dutch, although, as I said, Dutch capital remained in Indonesia until 1956-57, when workers in the trade unions occupied all of the Dutch enterprises, kicked out the management, and then soon after that, the Indonesian parliament nationalized all those Dutch enterprises. Of course, there were limitations, as I said. First of all, tensions amongst the countries attending it, and then we saw later on tensions between the non-aligned movement, which was associated with the Bandung Conference, and Asia-Africa Solidarity Organization. But in addition to that, from Indonesia's own point of view, the gathering in Bandung, did not help, actually, did not play a direct or major role in being able to defeat imperialist interventions into the region. There was the PRR, Pramoedya, right-wing military rebellion establishing a alternative Republic of Indonesia government in the late 50s, supported by the US and Australia. There was the formation of Malaysia, and the Malaysian political leadership's refusal to hold a referendum in Sarawak and Sabah and North Kalimantan. There's general hostility still from the rest of Southeast Asia, and the Bandung Conference, especially the Southeast Asian countries, actually lined up more with the United States over the war in Vietnam as it developed in the 1960s. The Chinese Cultural Revolution also became another magnet for imperialist hostility. So the non-aligned movement, as it emerged after the Bandung Conference, was not adequate, and Sukarno took the position that actually what was necessary was alignment, to align, not to seek a position of non-alignment. But Sukarno argued that in the late 50s and into the 60s, that peaceful coexistence could not exist between what he called the new emerging forces, 𝗍𝗶𝘁, and the old established forces, 𝗍𝗲𝗁, and that non-alignment was only meaningful if it was interpreted in the context of an ongoing struggle against imperialism. But I think very much as in the same spirit as Pramoedya, when Sukarno talked about alignment against imperialism, it was also consistent with a similar kind of internationalist outlook that we found in Pramoedya. In one of Sukarno's speech, he said the following: being non-aligned does not mean being a buffer state between two giant blocks. Non-alignment is active devotion to the lofty causes of independence, abiding peace, social justice, the freedom to be free. It's determination to serve the cause. It runs congruent with the social conscience of man. So for him, alignment, non-alignment had no meaning unless in fact you were positioning yourself in an actual real struggle. It wasn't a question of being located between blocks. It was in 1960 actually in the United Nations that Sukarno first formally articulated the concept of new emerging forces and old established forces. He said new forces, NEFO are the anti-colonial, represents the rising tide of nationalism, struggle for social justice. The anti-colonial forces, and old established forces, representing imperialism, colonialism, and neo-colonialism in all its forms. Now, I think underpinning Sukarno's thinking about new emerging forces, we do find the 𝗩𝗪𝗶𝘁𝗄 internationalism that Sukarno adhered to since the 1920s. I think this is quote from his autobiography or biography written by Cindy Adams. He said, in this period, the 1920s, I drank from many wells, from Thomas Jefferson, from Tom Paine, from Sun Yat-sen, from Marx and Lenin. So again, it reflects the same kind of picture or process that Pramoedya depicted in Bloomingdale's and 𝗩𝗪𝗶𝘁𝗄, drawing, yes, from Sun Yat-sen in China, but also from the national revolution figures from the United States, both Thomas and Jefferson, you could say, on the right, and Tom Paine much more on the left, as well as from Marx and Lenin. So in this sense, his thinking, you could say, was also similar to Pramoedya's child of all nations. Pramoedya, as I said, also made a point of showing how the character Minka was very well aware of the first Asian Republic in the Philippines. And if we go through Sukarno's writings and reports of interviews and speeches he gave, he was also very familiar with the figures of national liberation in the Philippines. He read Rizal, saying he was not just a Filipino, he was a Malaya and an Asian, a man of the oppressed people. In his big courtroom speech, he also quoted from Bonifacio, and later on from I think he was quoting from one of the works by Luis Teodoro about Maldini. So again, there's China, United States, Philippines, and I haven't put it in this presentation, but he also, of course, often referred to some of the nationalist thinkers from the Arab world. So I think that's a very again, it's very consistent with the kind of internationalism that was depicted by Pramoedya earlier. So that kind of internationalism is what underpinned that outlook that Sukarno held since the 1920s, and I think and which Pramoedya clearly held, and which Pramoedya thought that his research brought him to the conclusion that at the beginning of the 20th century, all of the intelligentsia that ended up with a nationalist perspective was aware of China, Sun Yat-sen, the Philippines, and no doubt if people were to carry out further research, I'm sure we'd find that those countries are not the only country. Gandhi, for example, is another one that another person that Sukarno referred to and quoted from quite early. So this internationalism was still anti-imperialist. So the new emerging forces were no longer non-aligned. So in the alliances that were connected to the new emerging forces thinking and some of the practical projects that were undertook, the Soviet Union was there, the People's Republic of China was there, the North Korea was there, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam was, Cuba was there. They're all part of the new emerging forces. So out with the non-alignment. But I think the other, and of course it wasn't only the socialist states, but all of the states, all of the nations that still had to defend themselves from imperialism, the newly independent countries around the world coming under the aggression of imperialism, of neocolonialism. Anyone resisting imperialism and neocolonialism was a part of these new emerging forces also. Well, I think the other thing that brings us back to the 𝗩𝗏𝗃𝗃𝗃, Child of All Nations internationalism, is also that in Sukarno's concept, especially as he often explained it within Indonesia, also included the progressive peoples inside the imperialist countries. So on the one hand, he said, yes, 𝗍𝗏 is the cry of Asia, Africa, Latin America, the cry of all who say we will no longer be the hewers of wood and drawers of water for the West. Another quote, someone asked me, what is 𝗍𝗏? I said, look at Vietnam fighting America. Look at Algeria after France. Look at Cuba defying the US giant. That is 𝗍𝗏. It's not a club, it's a storm. So in these quotes, and many others, of course, he's referring to the nations and states of the third world, or what perhaps we would now call the global South. But he also frequently in speeches or interviews, comments, and so on, he also emphasized that progressive peoples in struggle, including those in the old deposed countries, in the imperialist countries, were also part of the new emerging forces. So in a speech to Indonesian youth in 1964, for example, he referenced the students in Japan, unions in Japan. This is 𝗍𝗏 blooming inside the garden of Auditorium. He referred to the French solidarity with the people struggling in Algeria, the 𝗍𝗏𝗃𝗃 marches in Britain, also part of the new emerging forces. And you know, in an interview with 𝗩𝗶𝘁𝗃, for example, an Australian left-wing journalist, one of Australia's greatest journalists, I think, ever, said, do not say America is all Auditorium. No. The black man in Harlem, the student in Berkeley, they are our brothers in 𝗍𝗏. And I think this is also very consistent with the kind of internationalism that we see depicted by Pramoedya in the thinking of people in the early 20th century, but by Pramoedya himself, and now, of course, here in these examples by Sukarno. I haven't read, this is a very interesting conflict between 𝗍𝗏 and Auditorium is not confined to Indonesia. Look at the United States. The Negroes in Harlem and Alabama, students in Berkeley, they are part of 𝗍𝗏. Even says, look at Australia, it's a new one on me. I haven't actually been able to find this as a direct quote, but it is cited in David Easter's book. And I know that in June 65, there was a huge rally in Surabaya in relation to, in solidarity with Vietnam. So it's very well something that he, could have, he very well will have said, I think. I have this other quote here also from Sukarno. There's a conflict which cuts deeper into the flesh of man, and that is the conflict between new emergent forces for freedom and justice and the old forces of domination. The one is pushing its head relentlessly through the crust of the earth, which has given its lifeblood, and the other striving desperately to retain all it can, trying to hold back the force of history. So I think Sukarno's internationalism is also very much, placed in a humanist framework, and I think it also reminds me very much of the way Pramoedya depicted his main character Minka in 𝗩𝗶𝘀𝗁𝗍𝗃, This Earth of Mankind, and 𝗩𝗲𝗱𝗁𝗍𝗃. There's quite a lot of written about those books, and often some of the scholars discussing it, and other people, readers as well, sometimes sort of see it as the books about identity. But I think you don't find in 𝗩𝗁𝗁𝗍𝗃, 𝗩𝗲𝗱𝗁𝗍𝗃, the main character Minka, or ever asking himself, what is my identity? Am I Javanese? Am I Indonesian? Well, even the word Indonesia didn't exist then. But rather, am I a free person? Am I a liberated person? Am I a modern person? So it's more related, I think, to the sign of spirit that Sukarno was also referring to here. It's a humanist internationalism, drawing from all of the progressive and revolutionary elements from around the world. So I just want to finish with a couple of comments about, well, what about today? Just go back to a point that I mentioned briefly earlier, that the Bandung conference was essentially a conference of states who manifested were the products of different political processes. Some were the products of socialist revolution or anti-colonial national revolution. Others were the process of, the local bourgeoisie's accommodation with imperial powers as they moved to independence. One of the things that we need to note is that no organized popular forces were present at the Bandung conference in any serious way. It was a conference of states. I think the difference with the new emerging forces was that Sukarno envisaged it as both an alliance of states, governments, but also of non-state political movements and forces. Today, we have the discussion of global north versus global south versus global north. And of course, that inherently, the way it's formulated these days, hits state against state. And as a result, can also, it's open to being interpreted as nations and peoples against each other. In that sense, it can become anti-internationalist. And of course, the logic that's often associated with it is that, yes, the American era is over. America as the imperial power is disintegrating, so one argument's going, and so we're going to have a new era. It's going to become the turn of Eurasia, or the turn of China, and so on. I think that is there's danger in those logics. In some ways, it's not an internationalist orientation. But of course, there's a certain reality underpinning the whole emergence of the global south versus global north dynamic. The non-imperialist states, the states which are oppressed and exploited by the nations, in fact, that are oppressed and exploited by the imperialist, the small imperialist club, North America, Western Europe, Japan, Australia. They at the moment have to really fight, whether they have a socialist economy, a hybrid socialist capitalist, or whether they have an out-and-out capitalist economy. They're all having to fight to defend their sovereignty. Because at this point in time, the imperialist countries, the capitalist countries, have this policy of aggressive containment to stop, slow down, or even stop, or even drive back the development of the global South nations. Even capitalist ones, it's drive them back. Austerity, neoliberalism, or in the case of Cuba and Venezuela, of course, it's a much more deadly aggression, as we see the United States today positioning itself for possible military action against Venezuela. And we have, of course, the internationally condemned embargo of Cuba, really making life in Cuba extremely difficult for its people and its government. And of course, the global South country that's made the most amazing achievements in its 70 years since the revolution, or 75 years since the revolution, namely the People's Republic of China. There's an all-out effort at by the United States at the moment, backed by Western Europe and Australia to a large extent also, to hold back the development of China. So naturally, these global South nations and their states have no choice. They have to defend their sovereignty against this US, possibly US-led attempt to contain their development, often contained in a very aggressive way. So it's real. I might argue that some of the logic to discussing it in this way is anti-internationalist, but there's a real basis to it which cannot be denied and cannot be avoided. But I still think a Bandung spirit, if it was to be revived, that's oriented to states alone, is not going to be adequate. What we really need is to revive the new emerging forces spirit. The whole concept, framework of new emerging forces and older established forces postulated basically two agencies. The world divided into two, which was also actually the position of Lenin and other Marxists at the beginning of the 20th century. There are oppressor and oppressed nations. And but I think that this means in the current context that these states, this is where I think there's still a high relevance of Sukarno's concept today. The states that are defending themselves, in some cases defending socialism, in some cases developing their right to develop in their own sovereign way against imperialism, are going to be aligned with non-state popular forces. We've seen some elementary or beginning elements of this. We've seen, 𝗩𝗶𝗶𝗀𝗶, which was in Brazil, didn't have full Brazilian government participation, but it was blessed. There's the International People's Assembly, which is still a fairly loose organization. It had its last big conference in Johannesburg, where figures from the South African government also spoke. And also recently in Brazil, where also figures from the Lula government also spoke as well. Of course, we have various Venezuelan, Cuban initiatives, large congresses that aimed against fascism or imperialism. And I think the big question is that will any of the current Chinese initiatives of the People's Republic of China radicalize and deepen? Will they become more like a new emerging force kind of alliance? Now we've seen Beijing launch the Global Civilization Initiative, the Global Development Initiative, and others, which are basically initially sort of south to south, based on the ideas of greater south-to-south cooperation. But and it's basically still at the state or government level. The question is, I think, will that deepen further? So to end, I think I should disclose. I'll disclose, is that a word? First of all, I've been speaking about new emerging forces and the global South and colonialism and imperialism. I need to disclose, I am a citizen of an old established fourth state, Australia, and a settler colonial, a state founded on genocide and settler colonialism and that. But I think I'm also part of the NEFOS in the sense that an individual and a member of different organizations try to strengthen the development of the new emerging forces. And I certainly hope there'll be more Bandung conferences, but with the 𝗍𝗶𝘁 popular forces also present alongside states. My personal opinion is that the ideas and initiatives that will lead to new Bandung 𝗍𝗶𝘁 politics will actually come from everywhere around the world, not from one block or section or part. I also believe that the People's Republic of China is the most economically developed of the global South countries, has a huge responsibility to support and encourage not just South-to-South cooperation, but global cooperation at both state and popular level. And I believe, and I think this is a very important point, I think the working people of the USA are going to need to deliver real blows against US chauvinism and so release the full positive and creative energies of America. You know, I suppose over the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years, a long time now, if you're in Australia or United States or Western Europe and you say international solidarity action, it's going to be someone like me in Australia or someone like me in America or whatever, supporting Cuba or Venezuela, or in Australia in the 1940s, supporting the Indonesian struggle for independence. But I think we also might have to see this also be very interactive in the future. If authoritarianism becomes a real serious danger or threat or reality in the United States, people in the Philippines and in Indonesia and Australia might have to go out in demonstrations in solidarity with workers and students in the United States if they come under repression. But I also think that it will actually be from Southeast Asia and Indonesia that we will again see breakthroughs in new emerging force thinking. It's no accident that Southeast Asia produced Pramoedya and Sukarno, and that Pramoedya is now being creatively rediscussed in the Philippines. And also, most recently, it's being retranslated and published in China. So long live South-South cooperation, but also long live humanist internationalism. Thank you.